Okay, so I'm sitting in Henderson's Cafe in Edinburgh, and I'm talking to Gary Duncan about his new book of flash fiction called You're Not Supposed to Cry. First of all, Gary, could you tell me about the book, about its genesis, about how it came together as a book?
Certainly, yeah. It's a collection of flash fiction or short stories. There are about 50, 60 stories in the collection. Some of them go back 2-3 years. Some were written in the last few months before publication. So there's a sort of a 2-year, 3-year span while I put them all together. Some have been published already in magazines. Most of them are new, original for the collection. I suppose they range from anything from about 100 words to 1,000 words for the longest one, I think. They cover a number of areas. I suppose a lot of people have said they cover the mundane, the everyday, everyday people, everyday situations, looking for the small details in people's lives.
Oh, okay. I mean, I'm actually looking at the cover, which was designed by Martin Beacon, who's our resident cover designer, and it's got that kind of retro 50s look of a primary school spelling chart with a number of tiny little details, like a clipboard, a wheelie bin, a cigarette. And do these reflect the stories? Are these taken directly from stories in the collection?
They are, yes. There's a number of images on the cover, and each one, I think it's quite it's a very clever design, because it does suggest that there's quite a lot in the book. It's not just there are common themes. A number of stories touch on the same themes, possibly the same characters. Some are linked deliberately, some not so deliberately, but there's still a common connection there between the characters and some of the themes I've been looking at. I think in terms of where the stories came from, people tend to know, where did you get the ideas from, things like that. And I think a lot of the stuff I used to read when I first started to write many years ago were Northern English working class writers, Stan Barstow, Alan Sillitoe, people like that. And that kind of stuck with me for a long time. I read those when I was about 17, 18. And you read people like that and you think, this is something I can relate to myself. The whole thing about people say write about what you know about. So I've kind of done that without realising. Subconsciously, I suppose I've done that. And a lot of the stories are, most of them are set in, not specifically, but they're set in and around Northumberland, northeast of England. And most of the people in the stories are, you could probably say, are working class people who tend to lead fairly mundane lives on the surface, but hopefully the stories are looking beneath the surface. I think a good flash will be a glimpse of what's going on, so you don't necessarily know what the whole backstory is. You haven't got time to do that if you've only got 500 words. But hopefully you'll get an idea of a bigger story within these snippets or within these glimpses of stories. And again, I think if a good flash story works, you'll have someone read it. Probably it'll take a few minutes to read it, but then they'll be thinking about it, and then they'll be going back and possibly linking some of the stories and thinking, that might be related to that one. And hopefully there'll be a nugget in there that they can go away and think about, and hopefully go back and read the story.
And that's something I was going to ask you about. I was looking at one of the flash fiction websites. In fact, it might have been the website for one of the literary prizes. It might have been the Bridport Prize or something. And it said that exactly what you said about a good flash fiction has the ability to imply or hint at a larger story. And of course they quoted that famous Ernest Hemingway 6-word story, for sale, baby shoes, never worn, which makes the reader do a lot of the work, which is fantastic. But how do you define what is flash fiction then?
I think technically, if you look at most websites, I run a flash fiction website myself, Spelk Fiction, and we have a 500-word limit, give or take. Probably the best flash fiction website out there, the International Flash Fiction Short Story magazine at the University of Chester, they have a 360-word limit. So I think there is a bit of a grey area. The lines are fairly blurred between what is flash fiction or when a flash fiction becomes a short story. I'd like to think anything over about 1,000 is probably a short story. Anything less than that, 700-800 words, is a flash fiction. Having said that, you also have drabbles, which are 100-word stories, which is quite a big thing. There's quite a few very good websites out there now that do that. There's a 101 word short story website. And even if you go even further down, there's you have sudden fiction, microfiction, lots of different terms for things that are even shorter, 50, 60 words. But I think myself, I tend not to, if someone asks what the book's about, I tend to say flash fiction or short stories. I think for me there is a blurred line there, and I don't think it helps to say that's definitely a flash or that's definitely a short story, because a short story can go up to 5,000 words.
I mean, do you think when it gets down to that level of brevity, when you're writing a short story of 101 words or 100 words or 50 words or something like that, then it starts to be a comparison with poetry, because you can't spare a single word, whereas even a short story or a novel, there might be one or two words in excess, but you cannot have anything in excess if you're writing a flash fiction with that level of brevity.
I think that's true, yes. I think that's the challenge, and that's why personally I do like it, because I like to try and tell a big story in as few words as possible, and if you can do that in 300 words, I don't see the need to do that in 500. If you can say it in 300, you say it in 300. I've tried to take a few of the flash stories that I've done, and I've tried to extend them and play with them and develop the characters and add scenes and that, but usually I'll add 200 or 300 words and then reread it a few days later, then chop them all out again. I think if it's 300, it's 300. Now, I think you mentioned the competition before. I think the quote you mentioned about keeping about a flash being a glimpse of something bigger. I think David Gaffney, who has said that before as well. He's probably the best flash fiction writer out there at the moment, and he calls one of his collections was Sawn Off Tales, and you get the idea that it's from what I've read about what he does, he writes big first. He'll overwrite the story, and then he'll cut it until he gets, I think in Sawn Off Tales are usually about 150 words, which is that's at the shorter end of the flash spectrum. But you can see how he does that. You read his 150 word stories, and he could probably write that as a 1,000 word story, and it would still be a great story, but he cuts it just down to the bone, just exactly what you need to know, and the rest he will leave. I think in some of the ones I've done as well, I like to think if there's one story about a couple who have lost a child, and in the original version I described a little bit about that. I did a few scenes, a few paragraphs on that, and then went back to it and took it all out again, because I think for the purpose of the story, all you need to know is that they're bereaved parents. You don't need to know the whys and the hows of what happened, and I think once you start doing that, once you start explaining everything, you're not really letting the reader do anything for themselves. You're explaining everything to them.
Yeah, I'm reminded of something somebody said of Chekhov's plays, and they described Chekhov as looking at life through a keyhole into someone's house, and he didn't know what was happening over there to the left or over there to the right, but he was telling a story about what he could see, and I think that's really interesting, the idea you don't have to know everything, and sometimes the writer doesn't know everything. All they know is a little bit of the story that they have told us. That's all you have to know, but it's not always important that you go into detail, you tell everything.
I think so, yes. If we're just sitting here and we see somebody in the corner, some person in the corner, you can imagine what that person's life is like. You can read between the lines. You can imagine what's going on with that person, but you wouldn't know the whole story unless you knew that person. So I think that's what I quite like as well. You take a person or you take a scene, and you approach it as an outsider, and you put your impressions onto that person or onto that scene, and you take away just the bit that you want to get across, like the bereaved parents. That was the story. The rest is just incidental background that you don't need to know.
You have endorsements in the book by other flash fiction writers and editors of flash fiction magazines. Peter Blair, Ashley Chandler of the International Flash Fiction Association, Santino Prinzi, author of Dots and Other Flashes of Perception. So is there quite a flash fiction movement out there, and how long has it been going on?
I think there is, yes. It is a very close-knit community. A lot of the people who are in it are also obviously writers of other fictions as well. I think that's one thing I'm always quite aware of. I don't want to be known as just a flash fiction writer. I I think you can write a really good flash, or you can write a really good short story. Most people then suggest, why do you write a proper novel next? That tends to be the natural assumption that
a proper novel.
Exactly, that you can't write a full-length novel. So this is just a bit of foreplay before you get to the big proper 500-page novel. But within the Flash community, I think there is the people you mentioned were. I think we all are kind of aware that we're in this small community. It's still a fairly small thing. You mentioned Flash to most people, and they're not quite sure what it is. So you tend to just say short stories by way of explanation. But there are a number of magazines now. I think the oldest magazine is about 10, 15 years old, possibly. That was I think the Vestal Review in the US. A lot of this has come from the US. A lot of the magazines I read and a lot of the writers I follow are based in the US. There is a push in the UK now. There's Tanya Hirschman, who's had a couple of Flash books out. She set up a website called Short Stops, which is a resource for UK and Irish flash fiction writers. And she has lists of dozens, if not hundreds, of magazines on that. So it is a very small but vibrant community.
Yeah, it's interesting that in America, the short story is very highly regarded. I mean, it still is in this country, but there's something about the short story. Some people have described it as an American genre. That they mastered it. What do you think about that?
I think that's a fair comment as well. I think you only have to look at the amount of publishers in the UK who will even consider to read flash fiction or short stories. It is a very hard market to get into, and I think that's why there is such a vibrant community of small presses and online magazines and websites. So I think we're all kind of aware of that. We're all trying to promote this, and we do tend to do that. There's a lot of sharing of ideas, a lot of sharing of stories, mainly online through these communities and forums.
Now you have your own magazine. Is it an online or a print magazine called Spelk? Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, Spelk Fiction was something I set up in 2013. It came out of my interest in short stories originally. I was writing short stories, selling them. I was never paid for any of them. I was having them published by websites in the UK and the US. Back in 2013, I did a lot of crime short stories. So websites like Shotgun Honey in the US, Near to the Knuckle in the UK, Flash Fiction Offensive, the 3 or 4 big websites. So I'd had a few stories published in those kind of magazines, but at the same time I was also going back to what I mentioned earlier about the smaller, more mundane stories that I used to read. Inspired by Alan Sillitoe and Stan Barstow. So I wanted to try and find a few more markets like that, and most of the short story magazines, they either did crime or they did other stuff. What I wanted to do was to go onto a website and read a crime story on a Monday, on a Wednesday read a more literary thing, perhaps, if you want to call it that, something else the next week, different genres. There weren't too many of those around at the time, so as I was getting into this short story community, I thought I would just set up my own website to do that. And that was the premise behind it. We would publish anything around about 500 words, regardless of genre or style, location of writer, anything. We would just open the gates and see what came in. And a lot of the stories that appear in here were inspired by that time. And I had a 6-month period where I was writing 1 or 2 flash fictions a day, and then some of them have ended up in this collection.
Where do you write?
I write at home. I work at home. I'm an editor. I work full time at home. So I have my own office at home. I have two setups. I have a work computer, a work desk, and I have a non-work computer and a non-work desk. So I spend a fair amount of my time scooting back and forward between the two, writing a quick story and back to work. But I do stay at home most of the time. I do like to go out to coffee shops a lot as well. Depending on how busy I am, but I like to get out every day if possible to sit in a cafe or sit by the beach and write there as well.
Fantastic. And last question, why should people read flash fiction?
I think because it is something fairly new still in this country. I think, as we've said before, there are certain countries. Germany, for example, they have more of a tradition of shorter work, shorter collections. I think it's in France or Germany you can buy short story collections from vending machines in train stations and things like that. So I think it's for me it's ideal if I'm travelling. I can sit down, I can read 3 or 4 stories in a short journey. I do tend to read very, very long novels or very short flash fiction, one or the other. I'm kind of stuck between the two.
Thank you very much, Gary Duncan.
Very much.